So I'm going to be talking about research that we've been conducting on fish populations in the lower James River in South Dakota. So why do we decide to start studying these populations? We had some very vocal interest from a select angling group of catfish anglers that thought there was overharvest occurring, especially on these trophy fish in the lower James River, and they really wanted to see the game fish and parks take some kind of action to put a regulation on and protect those big fish. So when we were approached with these questions, didn't have any information to share because the last time these populations were studied was actually nearly 20 years ago, 1999 and 2000. And we hadn't been doing any monitoring, so we wanted to collect some data and evaluate any potential regulation or management actions that we would put on these populations. So our primary research goals were first to estimate the regular population dynamics data on these channel and flathead populations. We also wanted to try and get at exploitation. We had a tagging component of our study where we put out various reward tags in the system to try and get tag returns from the anglers. We were going to use those tags to gain some insight into movement of those fish during our resampling events and from those angler recaptures. And then we also were going to model some regulation scenarios. We're not going to talk at all about the movement data today just because of the time, but for the most part, fish weren't moving from what we were seeing in our recapture events. So here's our study reach. It's right along the border, Lake Lewis and Clark right here. So this would be the Nebraska, and this is South Dakota. So it's right along the border there. It's the lower stretch of the James River that we were working on right near the confluence of the Missouri River. Sampling reach had about 105 river kilometers that we were working on, but only a portion of that was sampleable due to access issues along there. There's only a handful of access sites, and some of those are blocked off by low-head dams that you can't move boat traffic up and over. So all the study took place in 2008. We sampled flatheads from May to June and channels from May to July. And then we also attended some fishing tournaments at 3 locations to kind of supplement our data with our regular sampling. We collected channel catfish, primarily using tandem hoop nets, baited with cheese and soybean cake. We used low-frequency electrofishing as our primary capture technique to collect flathead catfish. We also did supplement our flathead samples with some trot lines. We baited with live black bullheads. We were specifically trying to catch some of the larger size fish with that. And then, as I mentioned, we did supplement our population dynamics data a little bit with some of the information from those fishing tournaments. So every fish we caught, we took lengths weights. We pulled a subsample of pectoral spines for aging. We tagged those fish and released all the fish that we could back live. From there, we were estimating our exploitation using the equation provided by Sullivan and Vinning in the last catfish textbook or proceedings book. We evaluated mortality using catch curves, and then we also modeled a couple of other components using the FAM software to get at natural mortality and some of our fishing mortalities that we could then use in our models. And then we also created von Bernoulli growth curves from our age and length data. Then we inputted this into FAMs. We were really looking at 2 things. First, we wanted to evaluate the yield and see what changes would occur in that given the implementation of any regulations. And then we also wanted to look at the percent of memorable length fish in the system, which is what our anglers were really asking for, was would a regulation change the size structure in particular of those large or trophy size fish. And we evaluated 3 scenarios essentially. One was a status quo. We do not have a length limit on our populations right now, so we evaluated that. We then looked at a 1 over regulation where we assumed using 24 inches or 610 millimeters as our cutoff point that harvest would be reduced by about 50% above that regulation. And then we also, just for comparison, then modeled a maximum size limit where no harvest was occurring over that 24 inches. So to get into the results, to start with, we had very few tag returns over the past 2 years. So these are total tag returns here. So we tagged 388 channel catfish in 2018. Over the course of 2 years, we only had 5 of those returned by our anglers. And we had 19 of our 567 flatheads returned. And of those, all the channels were harvested, only 7 of those flatheads were harvested. So our tag return data showed that our exploitation rates were less than 1% annually on these populations. For channel catfish, we have these low exploitation values. We evaluated our total annual mortality with our catch curves. There was a fair amount of variability. We were hoping to do several years of consecutive sampling on the James River. Unfortunately, last year we set an all-time high record for water in the system and sustained the major flood stage throughout the year, so we weren't able to pair this up with multiple years of data. But we estimated our total annual mortality was 25%. There's a pretty good variability in your class strength, so there's some pretty good range about that, and we think that might be a little bit low, but that's very similar to some of the historic values excuse me, from 20 years ago. Flathead, on the other hand, we were a little bit more successful, seemed to be a little bit more consistent recruitment, and so our total annual mortality was a little bit more precise, and we estimated total annual mortality on our flatheads was 24%, which again was very similar to the last time these populations were studied about 20 years ago. So looking at growth, we compared our growth in these populations to the North American averages that were provided by Jackson et al. In 2008. And then we also looked at our historic data. So just looking first at North American curve, our James River population there in the solid line, you can see falls pretty close to the North American standard for channel catfish, and then maybe slightly exceeds it as we get to some of the older ages that we observed. But it, for the most part, is very close, mirroring that North American curve. When we compare it to, and they're a little bit hard to see here, sorry, compare it to our historic data, we had 2 channel catfish sampling events on the lower James River. First was done by Kubini in 1992, and it's the dotted line that pretty well follows almost exactly what our population was exhibiting in 2018. And then the other one was Arterburn in 2001, and that's a little bit faster growth. The things to point out about those 2 studies, Arterburn's study in 2001 occurred following 8 years of very high water levels, and whereas Kubini and our study had lower water levels and were a little bit more fluctuating. So we think that there's a pretty good water level effect. The other thing that could be influencing our catfish populations, following Kubini's study in 2001, the lower James River was invaded by Asian carp. So there is the potential that those could be impacting these populations. Flathead catfish is a different story. You can see that they are growing substantially slower than the North American average. We are nearing the northern range of these populations up there in South Dakota. And as you can see, there are very few individual fish that actually met or exceeded North American average. And when we compare that to Kubini, we are slower than Kubini. Again, lower water level conditions, possible influence of Asian carp in the system. So there are some growth differences that are occurring there. Looking at yield then, channel catfish. So first let me just point out, so we modeled this over the course or over the range of all conditional fishing mortalities essentially. The kind of grayed in box here is the estimated values for a range of fishing mortality from our population based on the FAMS modeling. So as you can see, it's extremely low, which matched up with our exploitation rates that we observed from tag returns. And under these 3 regulations, the no length limit, which is essentially the status quo, is our solid line with the dots there. You can see implementing these regulations, either the 1 over or a maximum size limit, we would see a slight decrease in our yield, but overall it wouldn't be anything substantial. And in general, we're not achieving our maximum sustained yield, and it's likely that this population is probably being underutilized in terms of harvest. Flatheads, on the other hand, we're nearing that peak. So if our goal was to be achieving maximum sustained yield at current conditions, we're pretty close to that based on our range of fishing mortalities that we're observing. Implementing a 1 over regulation, we would see a slight decline, but if we moved to a maximum size limit on flatheads, we'd see a pretty sizable decline in the yield potential of this population. And then getting into the percent of memorable fish in the system, the thing that really interests our angling group. We again modeled this over a range of conditional natural mortalities. So if you want to focus, this is our mean value, this vertical line here. So our mean natural mortality estimate for this population for channels was 0.18. And as you can see, we had a pretty low percentage of our population that was actually achieving memorable size as is under the status quo regulation. And by implementing either the 1 over or even going to a maximum size limit, we would have only seen about a 1% increase, a very small increase in the number of memorable size fish in the population. For flatheads, it looks like it's a little bit better, but again, looking here at our estimated natural mortality mean value, currently we expect that there's only about 1% of our population that's achieving memorable size, and that implementing the 1 over regulation might bump us up to about 2%. So it would be a small increase. Was able to do all this work just as we had a group of anglers put forward a regulation proposal to our commission. So they had been vocal for a long time about this, and then they decided to take matters into their own hands and propose a regulation on flatheads only in South Dakota waters. And it looks like we're going to be moving forward with a 1 over 28 or a 1 over 30 inch regulation on our inland waters statewide. So our results are showing there's going to be a small increase at 1 over 24. So as the regulation gets implemented, we expect it's even going to be a smaller increase than what our models were showing. So overall, flathead catfish were growing slow, and especially in particular compared to the North American average. They do have trophy potential. We did catch some trophy-sized fish, and part of that is simply due to low rates of mortality and exploitation. So we were seeing fish all the way out to about 25 years. But growth is definitely limiting this population. We were able to evaluate growth some of these modeling features using the old data from Arterburns' time frame when growth was faster, and we did see that the number of large fish in the system would have actually been much higher during that time frame compared to ours. Channel catfish, on the other hand, are growing at a much more moderate rate, and it appears that natural mortality is going to be more of a limiting factor on this population. The oldest fish we saw was 14 years, so the growth doesn't appear to be the issues with getting some large-sized channels in our populations. And then also we had low angler exploitation on these, based on our tag returns, and even on our modeling, they were estimating that exploitation would have been in the single digits. So it's likely that these populations are underutilized in terms of harvest. It's also likely that these populations are underutilized just in terms of angling pressure because of the limitations that the James River has with access. So our data kind of supports what our hypothesis walking into this was, based on a lot of the other research that's been conducted on catfish populations, that these 1 over regulations are probably not going to have a major impact in terms of restructuring the population size and improving the number of large fish in the population. So that's all I have, and I'll take questions.
We do have plenty of time for questions.
Yeah.
Your tandem improvements that you use for channel catfish, were those rigged like described in the review paper?
They were, yes. Yep. We actually had some challenges collecting channels in that system. We ended up having areas where we just completely blanked on channel catfish and ended up utilizing samples that were coming more from our angler data to really get at some of our growth characteristics. And then we had basically a 2-week window in July where we really hit channel catfish hard, and we struggled to catch them the remainder of the year. Yeah.
What was your source of soy cake?
Yeah, we have a processing plant in southeastern South Dakota that is kind of a feature of theirs that they produced. I don't remember the name off the top of my head, but I could get that for you if you're interested.
Perfect, thanks.
All right, thank you.